When you hear the word shipwreck, what pictures do you see in your mind? People in lifeboats? Wreckage lying on the bottom of the lake? A ship being smashed up against the rocks? A sailor clinging to a floating piece of his ship? Well, we'll be talking about all of these things in the story of the sailing shipwrecks of Lake Superior. Most sailors think Lake Superior is by far the most dangerous of the Great Lakes. Perhaps they're right, if you add up all the shipwrecks on the lake. Why, then, is the big lake thought of as so ferocious? Until the middle 1800s, there were no cities or towns along the shores of Lake Superior. Shipwrecked sailors, lucky enough to get to shore, were faced with wilderness coastlines and many miles from help. Small wooden ships called schooners carried food, clothing, and mail to the few trading posts scattered around Lake Superior. They brought back the trappers' furs to the big fur companies. The American Fur Company, built by John Jacob Astor, became the largest of the ships on Lake Superior. It was 78 feet long and also the first ship made in America to sail on Lake Superior. The year was 1835. Captain Stannard and his brother sailed the Astor on the lake for 9 years. Typical of their best sailing guides was a coal oil lamp sitting on top of a tall pole at Copper Harbor in the Keweenaw Peninsula of Michigan. The lamp no more than a faint glow at night or in a snowstorm. Captain Stannard brought the Astor into Copper Harbor in September of 1844 through a howling gale wind. The ship was unloaded the next day, but the day after, the furious wind and waves broke the anchor chains and smashed the Astor against the rocks on shore. Captain Stannard had hoped to fix up the Astor, but winter came early that year. By spring, the ice and the wind had finished the destruction of the ship. Michigan's state geologist, Dr. Douglas Houghton, announced that copper was discovered on Michigan's Upper Peninsula, and mining towns then appeared all along the shores of the lake in the 1840s, and shipping began to grow, and with it, the possibility of shipwrecks. Unfortunately, Dr. Houghton drowned in Lake Superior when his Mackinac boat overturned. Mackinac boats were used only in the Upper Great Lakes area. They were large wooden rowboat types with high sides and sails. The biggest problem for the miners who wanted to ship their goods were the rapids on the St. Mary River at Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. The portage around the rapids was more than a mile long. To portage a ship around the rapids meant dragging it on rollers pulled by oxen, horses, or men. It could take as long as 7 weeks, and it would cost thousands of dollars. Since there were few large ships on the lake, the goods they carried were very important to the waiting settlers. The tiny schooner Siskiwit, loaded with supplies for Marquette, Michigan, couldn't make it in the bad weather. The skipper was forced to dock 80 miles away. Then 2 brave settlers from Marquette snowshoed the 80 miles and sailed the ship home. The supplies were unloaded on Christmas Day. However, when they sailed the ship to a river channel, they missed their turn and waves destroyed the empty ship. The Sioux locks opened up Lake Superior to ships from the lower Great Lakes in 1855. The shipping of iron and copper for the Civil War caused a shipping boom. The schooner Oriole was loaded with iron ore and headed for Erie, Pennsylvania, when a thick fog set in. In the middle of the night, a steamer struck the ship and cut her in half. Cook Fleming was the only survivor. He floated on a piece of wrecked ship for a day and a half before he was finally rescued. Until then, the captain of the steamer Illinois didn't even know that he had sunk the Oriole. From 1865 to 1867, there were no shipwrecks or lives lost. But in 1869, the W.W. Arnold left Marquette. It was heading for Cleveland with a load of iron ore. The lighthouse keeper reported the worst gale wind in the past 24 years. The Arnold never did reach the Sioux Canal. Marquette townspeople couldn't believe the news. No one knew what had happened to the ship. But about a month later, a mail carrier saw the ship's wreckage near Whitefish Point, Michigan. And then 2 weeks after the disappearance of the Arnold, Marquette was hit by another killer storm. 4 ships in the harbor were damaged, and a 5th, the Bermuda, was grounded on its way into port. During the 1870s, railroads reached Duluth and Thunder Bay, Ontario, and they then became growing shipping centers. However, more shipwrecks were reported in the 70s than in all 80 years of shipping previously. 25 ships went down, and 81 people died. November 1872 was a month of terrible storms. One storm hit Minnesota Point in Duluth, where ships were anchored in those days. The gale winds picked up 4 ships and threw them onto the beach. On November 27th, 2 schooners, the W.O. Brown and the Charles C. Griswold, were destroyed by the gale winds and waves, and only 3 men from the Brown survived. The 3 men clung to the ship's wreckage and finally were able to swim to shore. Temperatures were below 0, but they kept alive by burning the wreckage of the ship. They started the fire by shooting a gun into a wool shirt. The men ate raw wheat from the ship, which they then boiled in water. Eventually, they built a raft and paddled to a logging camp. Those 3 men were very lucky. Luck plays a big part in many stories of shipwrecked survivors. The McGuire brothers set off from Upper Michigan in a small sailboat in November of 1874. They were looking to find work at a silver mine near Thunder Bay. A raging blizzard swept their tiny sailboat onto the rocks of Isle Royal. Mike McGuire landed safely on the shore, and then he rescued his brother John from the icy waves. And with a pocket full of dry matches, they soon had a roaring fire going. By the next day, John was dry, but too tired to move. Mike fixed up a shelter from fir branches and gathered firewood. The next step was to find food. Mike knew they were on Isle Royal and that there was a mine on the other side. Luckily, he found a cabin stocked with dried beans. He built a fire, and while the beans were cooking, he carried John through miles of snow to the cabin. The 2 brothers stayed in the cabin for several weeks, living on beans and wild rabbits. Mike had heard the mine whistle in the distance one day, and they both made snowshoes from twigs and bark and determined they would find the place. They packed up a supply of food for the long hike. Although John's legs were crippled, they trudged through miles of snow and many bad storms before they finally reached the mine. The kind boss at the mine fed them. In fact, he even gave them jobs. In the 1880s, the old wooden schooners were changed into tow barges, like the Jupiter and Saturn that we spoke of earlier. The old wooden sailing ships could not hold as much cargo, nor could they go as fast as the new steamers. Some shipwrecks had nothing at all to do with bad weather. When the Guido Pfister sailed into Duluth, a tug was waiting to take her through the old Duluth Ship Canal. When the tow line was tossed from the Pfister, the tug crewman missed the catch. The ship kept right on going, and it smashed into Minnesota Point. Fortunately, the crew and the coal cargo were both saved. When the schooner barge Plymouth was tied to the steamer Chauncey Hurlburt, the rope slipped and the Plymouth ran aground. Over the winter, ice formed, which protected the ship from further damage, and in the spring, the boat was repaired, and it sailed away for many more years. The fall of the year usually brings the worst storms on Lake Superior, but any month can bring bad weather. On June 19th of 1889, a thick fog covered the whole lake. 6 ships ran into trouble in that fog. The schooner Monterey was being towed by the tug A.C. Adams near Whitefish Point, Michigan. Both ships were grounded. Even though the Monterey was badly wrecked, it was repaired, and it sailed for 14 more years. At the end of the 1800s, when big steel freighters took over the shipping on the Great Lakes, why did the shippers bother to hang on to the old wooden schooners? The answer is money. It was much cheaper to repair the old wrecked schooner than to buy a brand new freighter. U.S. lifesavers played an important part in the early years of shipping. In October of 1902, the tiny schooner W.T. Chapel was loaded with wood and having trouble in a storm. Lifesavers from their station at Vermilion Point, Michigan, saw the ship go down. They set out in a lifeboat, and they rescued the captain and his only crewman just 2 hours later. The waves were too rough to return to Vermilion Point, so the lifesavers rowed for 8 miles to Whitefish Point and took shelter in the lighthouse. Time and time again, brave U.S. lifesavers risked their lives in tiny rowboats through waves that had grounded the great wooden schooners. The worst year for shipwrecks on Lake Superior was 1905. 21 ships were lost, along with bad weather and crew members' mistakes. Fire also caused wrecks of wooden sailing ships. The schooner barge Melvin S. Bacon was lost to a fire in the Ashland, Wisconsin harbor. Not all ships that sink remain on the bottom of Lake Superior. Few are brought back to the surface as a whole ship, to be sure, but parts and pieces are often recovered by divers. These things were brought up from the schooner Lucerne. It had left Washburn, Wisconsin on November 4th of 1886, taking iron ore to Cleveland, it had hoped, but after only a few hours out, the storm struck. There are a number of marine museums in cities on Lake Superior shores. These things are in the Corps of Engineers Museum at Canal Park in Duluth. They were recovered by scuba diver Monty Florenz. Up from the deep came the personal equipment of the 10-man crew, but none of the sailors lived. 3 of them tied themselves to the mast just above the water line. They were found a day later, but by then they were dead and covered with 6 inches of ice. The loss of this crew made it one of the worst of all the shipwrecks on Lake Superior. After World War I, very few wooden schooners were used. They had been the cheapest and the fastest means of shipping to that time. The steel freighters had taken over Great Lakes shipping. Monsters of metal the old sailors were sure could not even float. As we all remember from the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald, even some of them have been the victims of powerful Lake Superior storms.